Debord on this computer. Great. Yay. Okay, and now I'm going to spotlight myself for everyone. So you can see a big picture of me. Okay. So, as you know, this is our 8th meeting, and it's about the May 68 revolt in France, which is the thing the Situationists are most famous for. But it's a very famous thing, even if you've never heard of the Situationists. But in this case, um, uh, the way I discovered the Situationists was that I was an anarchist in 1969, had recently sort of converted from a generic new lefty kind of person. I and another friend of mine. And so we were reading these anarchist things, pamphlets, and one of the things that we saw was this book by Daniel and Combendit and his brother, I think Gabriel Combendit, in English called Communism, the left-wing alternative, which is not exactly, anyway, it was about May 68, and Daniel Cohn-Bendit, of course, was the most famous person, so-called Danny the Red. He was kind of like Mario Savio was in a little bit lesser thing for the free speech movement in Berkeley. He was the person who everybody liked. You know, he was kind of a gregarious, very sympathetic, kind of person. And very eloquent in a sort of naive, direct way, like just a sincere way. And so we read this book about May 68, and in the book, the Cohn-Bendit mentioned the Situationists, specifically the Strasbourg scandal and on the poverty of student life, which had just happened about a year and a half earlier. And, they said we were very influenced by this. This was very exciting and inspiring. And so then they went on to give their own analysis, which was more kind of anarchist, eclectic. So when we heard that, of course, we wanted to find out who these people were. And so we found some pamphlets, and that's how we discovered the Situationists. There had been other people around that knew about them, but they weren't very well known in the US. But once we got into that, we were just, whoa, this is really neat stuff here, that's even more interesting than the sort of generic anarchist stuff. So anyway, then we looked back. I mean, we had remembered May 68 when it happened, but we didn't know, like, what is that? Like, all I thought about it, and I think most people in the United States thought, oh, well, they're just doing things like we are. They're protesting against the government, like we were doing against Vietnam or for civil rights or something like that. And of course, that was not at all what was really going on. I mean, that would have been putting it ridiculously mildly. As the SI article says, this had nothing to do with de Gaulle. He just happened to be the head of the country, but that was completely irrelevant. Nobody was paying any attention to him whatsoever. They just knew he was there, just like we knew we had LBJ there or something, or Nixon or whoever would have been at the time. So anyway, so we have one topic for the whole thing, and I'm trying to figure out here we have the long article, which was by Debord, although it's not signed, but he wrote it, called Beginning of an Era. I mean, everybody else agreed with it, but as often at this later stage of the SI, he was doing most of the writing. They would discuss things, but he'd end up, in most cases, too. I'm going to just check that. So, here. Hello? I'm fine. I'm busy right now, but great, great. I'll see you then. Goodbye. Excuse me for that. I have a early flight tomorrow, and that was indeed my taxi confirming a pickup. So we have that long article that was written about more than a year after the event. And then we have some of the May 68 documents that were in May or June. And then I'm going, partly in response to Judy's request, I'm going to read a little thing that I wrote, or a couple passages that sort of go into May 68. So I'm going to start out just quoting from the article, just to sort of plunge in what's going on here. And then a little bit later on, we'll double back and say, well, how did this build up, or something like this. So this is near the beginning of the article. It would be pages 288 to 289. The largest general strike that ever stopped the economy of an advanced industrial country, and the first wildcat general strike in history. That was May 68. Revolutionary occupations and the beginnings of direct democracy, the increasingly complete collapse of state power for nearly 2 weeks, the resounding verification of the revolutionary theory of our time, and even here and there, the first steps toward putting it into practice. The most important experience of the modern proletarian movement that is in the process of constituting itself in its fully developed form in all countries, and the example it must now go beyond. This is what the French May 68 movement was essentially, and this in itself is already constitutes its essential victory. The occupations movement was the sudden return of the proletariat as a historical class, a proletariat now enlarged to include the majority of the salaried employees of modern society, in other words, the blue collar and white collar, and still struggling for the real abolition of classes and of wage labor. The movement was a rediscovery of collective and individual history, an awakening to the possibility of intervening in history, an awareness of participating in an irreversible event where, quote, nothing would ever be the same again, unquote. People looked back in amusement at the strange existence they had led a week before, at their outlived survival. It was a passion for bringing everything and everyone together, a holistic critique of all alienations, of all ideologies, and of the entire old organization of real life. In this process, property was negated, everyone finding themselves at home everywhere. The recognized desire for genuine dialogue, completely free expression, and real community found their terrain in the buildings transformed into open meeting places and in the collective struggle. The telephones, which were among the few technical means still functioning, and the wandering of so many emissaries and travelers around Paris and throughout the entire country, between the occupied buildings, the factories, and the assemblies, manifested this real practice of communication. The occupations movement was obviously a rejection of alienated labor. It was a festival, a game, a real presence of people and of time. And it was a rejection of all authority, all specialization, all hierarchical dispossession, a rejection of the state and thus of the parties and unions, and of sociologists and professors, of the healthcare system and repressive morality. Everyone awakened by the lightning chain reaction of the movement. One of the graffiti, perhaps the most beautiful, simply said, "Quick!" Thoroughly despised their former conditions of existence, and therefore those who had worked to keep them there, from the television stars to the city planners. Many people's Stalinist illusions in various diluted forms, from Castro to Sartre, were torn apart, and all the rival and independent lies of an era crumbled. International solidarity spontaneously reappeared. Numerous foreign workers flung themselves into the struggle, and many European revolutionaries rushed to France. The extensive participation of women in all aspects of struggle was an unmistakable sign of its revolutionary depth. There was a significant liberation of mores. The movement was also a critique, still partially illusory, of the commodity system in its lame sociological disguise as, quote, consumer society, unquote. Now I'm going to stop there. And so this is for you, Jenny. This is from my magnum opus called The Joy of Revolution, that you can find on my website, and I'll link to it later on. And in Joy of Revolution, it has 4 chapters. The first chapter is sort of introductory. The second chapter is normal times, so-called. Like, what do you do when things are like they are now, or something? So there are different things you could do. You could work for electoral politics. You could work for reforms. You could do blah, blah, blah. And then chapter 3 is about radical situations. This is something that are not normal conditions. And it makes a big difference because talking about the things in chapter 2 and chapter 3, they work very differently. In a radical situation, you can do things that you couldn't do normally. And I'll be explaining that. And then chapter 4 is, what if we won? What if there was a victorious revolution like I'm talking about in that little book? What would it be like? How would people, do blah, blah, blah? So this is in chapter 3, where we're talking about radical situations. So I'm going to quote about 3 paragraphs here, and you'll see this is partly. I also have some stuff specifically about May 68, but it's partly the type of things like May 68 or like the free speech movement. In such situations, people become much more open to new perspectives, readier to question previous assumptions, quicker to see through the usual cons. Every day, some people go through experiences that lead them to question the meaning of their lives. But during a radical situation, practically everyone does so all at once. When the machine grinds to a halt, the cogs themselves begin wondering about their function. Bosses are ridiculed. Orders are ignored. Separations are broken down. Personal problems are transformed into public issues. Public issues that seemed distant and abstract become immediate practical matters. The old order is analyzed, criticized, satirized. People learn more about society in a week than in years of academic social studies or leftist consciousness raising. Long repressed experiences are revived. Everything seems possible, and much more is possible. People can hardly believe what they used to put up with in, quote, the old days, unquote, referring to something a week or 2 ago. Even if the outcome is uncertain, the experience is often seen as worthwhile for its own sake. Quote, if we only have enough time, ... unquote, wrote one May 1968 graffitist, to which a couple others responded on the same wall. In any case, no regrets. And already 10 days of happiness, unquote. As work comes to a halt, rat race commuting is replaced by leisurely circulation, passive consumption by active communication. Strangers strike up lively discussions on street corners. Debates continue round the clock, new arrivals constantly replacing those who depart for other activities or to try to catch a few hours of sleep, though they are usually too excited to sleep very long. While some people succumb to demagogues, others start making their own proposals and taking their own initiatives. Bystanders get drawn into the vortex and go through astonishingly rapid changes. A beautiful example from May 1968. The director of the National Odeon Theater in Paris was at first dismayed at its being taken over by the radical crowds. But after taking in the situation for a few minutes, he came forward and exclaimed, yes, now that you have it, keep it. Never give it up. Burn it rather than do that. Have any of you seen the film Children of Paradise? Okay, one of the greatest films of all time. And you remember the star of that, Jean-Louis Barrault, who played the mime? He was that director. He had become the director of the National Odeon, you know, recognized, everybody loves him, great director, was great for that, you know, and you can see this guy, suddenly this is invaded by this, and he said, oh, you're going to tear everything down, you know, and then he looks at it and he starts to think about it and says, yeah, yes, go, don't give it up. You know, and that was just in a minute or two. You know, I mean, he was probably already a somewhat radical guy, but nevertheless, look at his position, you know. It reminds me a little bit of that, if you've ever seen the film of Dr. Zhivago. Dr. Zhivago has this big mansion, and at some point, you know, it's invaded by masses of starving people or something who have no place to live, you know. And he said, wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, and then he thinks about it and says, yeah, oh, okay, okay, yeah, actually, it's much fairer this way. You know, but under normal times, he never would have thought of that. Yeah, you know, but in this kind of thing, people are suddenly calling everything into question. I mean, literally, you know, not just like you might idly do in an academic debate or something. So that's the end of that quote. And I'm going to go back to the beginning of an era article as to who was doing this. It says, whatever the government, the newspapers, and the ideologists of modernist sociology pretend to believe, the May movement was not a student movement. And if you ever talk about May 68, many people, of course, have never even heard about it. But those who have that say, oh, yes, that student movement. I mean, that's the one thing they know about it, is that it was supposedly a bunch of radical students doing something, you know, that caused a big uproar. And so this is a very important thing. And even at the time, that was what was the newspapers all said, and all those students, you know, Combindi and those others, something. And if you actually look at how it was, they nuance this a bit. They say it was a revolutionary proletarian movement re-emerging after half a century of suppression. and generally deprived of everything. Its unfortunate paradox was that it was able to concretely express itself and take shape only on the very unfavorable terrain of a student revolt, the streets held by the rioters around the Latin Quarter and the mostly university buildings occupied in the same area. The May movement was not some political theory looking for workers to carry it out. It was the acting proletariat seeking its theoretical consciousness. What was both significant and unfortunate was the fact that the unions were eventually able to control the wildcat strike that had been launched against their will and despite all their maneuvers of the unions, the bureaucrats. Those union bureaucrats accepted the strike they had been unable to prevent, which is the usual tactic of a union faced with a wildcat, although this time they had to accept one on a national scale, which is not usual. By accepting this unofficial general strike, they remained accepted by it. The problem. They kept control over the factory gates, simultaneously isolating the vast majority of workers from the real movement and each plant from all the others. Just as the unions had to let the general strike spread little by little, winding up in virtual unanimity, so they strove to liquidate the strike little by little, using the terrorism of falsification and their monopoly of communication to coerce the workers in each separate enterprise to accept the crumbs they had collectively rejected on May 27th. So I'm going to read just about another page and a half here, and then we can have the Q&A. So this is in this page and a half, Debord briefly runs through the day-by-day thing, like what happened. From January to March 1968, the Enragés group of Nanterre, and this was the group that we'll hear about with Rizel and so on, whose tactics were later taken up in April by the March 22nd movement, which had Combendit and those people, successfully carried out the sabotage of classes and university departments. The Paris University Council's bungling and too belated repression, together with two successive shutdowns of the Nanterre University, led to the spontaneous student riot in the Latin Quarter on May 3rd. The university was paralyzed by both the police and the strike. There was fighting in the streets throughout the following week. Young workers joined in. The Stalinists discredited themselves each day by incredible slanders. On the night of May 10th, the uprising that took over the neighborhood around Rue Gay-Lussac set up 60 barricades and held it for more than 8 hours, rousing the entire country and forced the government into a major capitulation. It withdrew the police forces from the Latin Quarter and reopened the Sorbonne that it could no longer keep running. I want to do a quick screen share here. Let's see. Just to show you one picture. Now, where will I find it? Can you see that?
No.
Okay. Hold on just a minute. Let's see. Hmm.
There you go.
Okay. Whoops. Oh, there we go. Is that good?
Not yet.
We're
We just
looking for the image, but you've activated screen share for sure.
Right. Okay. Hmm. Share screen. Okay, here we go. Can you see that?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now let me. Okay, so here's the full photo. This is the day after May 10th. And this is one street. You can see these are automobiles, along with various other things that have been made to form barricades. And here's people walking around in sort of bewilderment, like, well. So I will stop the share. But just to get, you know, uh, just so you have an idea, like when they talk about, uh, let's see, 60 barricades, imagine that. We just saw 3 or 4 barricades on one block. 60 of those were in that neighborhood. So, as they say later on, these are not serious, like war level barricades. Obviously, the police, you know, could have brought in tanks or any number of things. This is not how you fight a war. But this isn't a war. This is like a thing that's being done in public with, in the face of the French population who is used to the concept of identifying with barricades, like, oh, that's like the Commune, that's like the French Revolution, that's like 1830, all these kind of things. And they can relate that, there were times when that sort of thing was a serious thing. You would put that up and then the bullets wouldn't hit you. I mean, obviously, when you've got helicopters and tanks and stuff like that, it would be completely meaningless. They could just go through and crush anything and anyone who was there. But the point is, as the Situationist said, did they dare? Because this is now out in public, it's on the news. These are your children. These are da da da, in this gallant old French tradition, of something. And who are you rooting for? Well, French people mostly don't like police. And they certainly didn't like police after World War II when they kind of had the Gestapo association there. So, in other words, most people in France, if they were following this at all, which they could hardly help doing, would sort of be rooting, for the and then they're saying, this isn't just a barricade, these are dozens of barricades, and they actually held off the cops because unlike in America, yeah, I mean, if that kind of thing happened in America, it would get totally crushed and there would be dozens of people killed instantly. But like I say, for those reasons, in Europe, uh, as brutal as the cops are, they can't afford to do something like that. Uh, they would say, what is your grounds for doing this? These people are just protesting. Okay, they destroyed some property. That's not a capital offense. Da da da. So anyway, the point is that when that happened, you might have had some people denouncing, oh, they're destroying those cars or blah, blah, blah. But by the next day, the government withdrew the police from the whole neighborhood because, like, the police had been occupying the Sorbonne. They had arrested hundreds of people in the days leading up to it. But once this had started, um, they would not dare. It's like, do you want to look like the Gestapo? Do you want to look like Hitler? you know, what's your grounds for this? You know, they're just protesting against, plus remember that workers are starting to get involved. You know, this isn't just like a few hippies or something that nobody else likes or whatever. So I'm kind of going on in this, but I wanted you to get a sense of the intensity of that kind of thing. I mean, it was something where people could have died. There were a few people who did die, but it was rare. Uh, so, uh, so the government withdraws the police forces from the Latin Quarter, and the Sorbonne is once again open. It's not functioning, but it's open. So immediately, from May 13th to 17th, the movement irresistibly advanced to the point of becoming a general revolutionary crisis, with the 16th probably being the crucial day, the day the factories began to declare themselves for a wildcat strike. The single-day general strike decreed for the 13th by the big bureaucratic organizations, the parties and unions, with the aim of bringing the movement to a rapid end, and if possible, turning it to their own advantage, was in fact only a beginning. The workers and students of Nantes attacked the prefecture, that's the police station, and those who occupied the Sorbonne opened it up to the workers. That was another significant thing. Maybe this started out with some just student stuff. But what they did is that at this point, they said, this is no longer a student. This is everybody. Come on in. Everybody who wants to. And so the Sorbonne, once the workers come there, along with all those students or non-student youth, the Sorbonne immediately became a club populaire, popular club, that made the language and demands of the clubs of 1848, that was when such things, seemed timid by comparison. This again was, actually there were clubs in the French Revolution too. It's like gatherings where people would, you know, discuss what are we going to do, debate, all this. So they're saying this is like, you haven't heard anything like this before. On the 14th, the workers of Sud Aviation, like it's an aircraft factory, of Nantes, occupied their factory and locked up their managers. Their example was followed by 2 or 3 other enterprises on the 15th, and by several more after the 16th, the day the rank and file imposed the Renault strike at Billancourt. So that's one of the biggest things in the country, the Renault factory. Virtually all the enterprises in the country were soon to follow, and I add a little footnote. By a week later than this, 11 million workers are occupying virtually every factory and many offices in France. That's starting from zero. Just after this little thing initiated by the Enragés, who were like about a half a dozen situationist influenced youth. And virtually all institutions, ideas, and habits were to be contested in the succeeding days. The government and the Stalinists made feverish efforts to bring the crisis to a halt by breaking up its main power, the workers. They came to an agreement on wage concessions that they hoped would be sufficient to lead to an immediate return to work. Everybody would get a significant raise plus additional vacation time. And all the unions were real pleased with that. And they came back to the workers and said, oh, we've got, you know, look what we got for you. And they were voted down on the 27th. The rank and file everywhere rejected those Grenelle Accords. The regime, in other words, like they're thinking, okay, this is good, but you know, this is bigger than that. We weren't just doing this to get more wages. You know, that's fine that we do that, but that's not what this has become now. This is about our lives, not about getting a little bit of, you know, crumbs from the table. So that was the high point of the workers' things, like where they rejected that, but they weren't quite sure where to go from there as we go on. The regime, which a month of Stalinist devotion had not been able to save, that's devotion to de Gaulle, really, although they're pretending to be opposed to him, saw itself on the brink of destruction. On the 29th, the Stalinists themselves had to recognize the likelihood of the collapse of the de Gaulle regime and reluctantly prepared, along with the rest of the left, to inherit its dangerous legacy, a social revolution that would have to be disarmed or crushed. De Gaulle, however, being more steadfast than the staff of his administration, relieved the Stalinists by announcing on the 30th that he would strive to maintain himself in power by any means necessary. That is to say, by calling out the army and initiating a civil war in order to hold or reconquer Paris. Quote, this is from the VNA book, the Stalinists, delighted, were very careful not to call for a continuation of the strike until the fall of the regime, which it would have done. They immediately rallied around de Gaulle's proposal of new elections, regardless of what it might cost them. Why would it cost them? Because elections is the terrain that this movement was not on. This movement was on the terrain of factories, streets, all of life. And to put it back into, oh, it's an election, if you don't like de Gaulle, you can vote against him, is putting it back on a completely irrelevant thing that had nothing to do with the movement. Nobody was revolting in order to have a different prime minister or something. That was not even ever expressed. So if it's accepted that that's the legit thing, and see here the communists, so-called, are saying, hey, good, we got a victory. We forced de Gaulle to have an election next week. Bullshit. But they're saying, hey, we won, comrades, yay for you and yay for us. We're gonna get to vote. And this kind of, well, it did work. It's sort of like, because it's a carrot and stick sort of thing. Remember, de Gaulle is saying, I'm offering you elections. You can vote against me if you want to. Do whatever you want. It's free country. The alternative, if you don't go for that, is that I'm bringing in the army and we're going to have a civil war here and you are going to get mowed down. So with that kind of alternative, a lot of people say, oh, well, I guess we got something out of it, right? Not everybody, but a lot of people. That's enough to sort of break the momentum of the movement. But the state, already so well defended by the bureaucratic left, could not be brought down against its will as long as the workers had not eliminated the power base of those bureaucrats by imposing the form of their own autonomous power. The workers left the state this freedom to call elections or launch a war, and naturally had to suffer the consequences. The majority of them had not recognized the total significance of their own movement, and nobody else could do it in their place. So I'm going to stop there, and let's have some Q&A. And I think you can raise your digital hand and I will see it and call on you. And you can also type something in the chat and the co-hosts will look at that and call my attention to it. So Mike Ballard, please unmute yourself.
I was just wondering how much discussion in all of these assemblies was centered on the question of wage labor, abolishing commodity production, and that sort of level of discussion, or what was the never mind, just that, I guess, or
Yeah.
abolishing classes.
Yeah. I think when you're in a situation like this, Mike, I think that with rare exceptions, people are not going to be saying, hey, let's abolish wage labor. That's like saying, hey, let's go to the moon. It's underlying there, it is a possibility, but it's not, most people wouldn't even know what the hell does that mean? You mean we shouldn't do things? No, but we shouldn't do things without paying for it. We shouldn't do it without paying for it. Well, you do without money if you're not going to use without money, or you're barter. There's just an infinite amount of this stuff that if that was all your policy was, nobody would be listening to you. Basically, and you will see that the Situationists and Alreges and a few other revolutionaries do raise those questions, but they're not raising it like that, like, hey, let's abolish wage labor. That's not, they're looking at what's going on. Hey, we have so-and-so has been arrested. The police are doing this. The workers in this factory are doing this. What is to be discussed in that situation is, hey, the workers are occupying that factory. What are they going to do? Now, if you just came in there and said, abolish wage labor, that's just meaningless. Their point is, are you going to tolerate these bureaucrats? If you're going to tolerate these bureaucrats, it's completely nonsense to say, we will tolerate these bureaucrats, but we're against wage labor. In other words, you have to start like, what's going on here? And then if you get into a discussion, yes, I mean, when they talk about these clubs or the discussions on street corners or something like that, then somebody can say, well, wait a minute, we don't want wages, we want blah, blah, blah. And other people will say, yeah, duh, but other people will say, what are you talking about? And so just to bring that up, yes, that's the basic program that's sort of been implicitly at stake for 2 centuries. And I mean, it was going back to Marx and so on. But to just discuss it kind of like idly, like you're in the middle of a thing where something will go on in some factory, say, or not. And it depends on how fast a certain number of people get it. And we're not talking about wage labor. They're just talking about, what do we do with this factory here? To hell with wage labor. Yeah. We're just saying, because the difference is, like, if they spend an hour saying, oh, we should abolish wage labor or down with the state or something like this. Meanwhile, the police have come in and arrested people, or, whatever the thing may be. You're not looking at the actual situation. So,
right. But I see that. But I was just curious about the level of discussion.
Well,
I think what they're playing on is the emotional wave of the exhilaration of the sort of power that was accruing, and they were riding the wave. But what I was I'm sort of hinting at the idea that the preparation for this, the unions like the CGT, and they were notoriously, I guess, led by the left for years.
Yeah.
And as anybody who has actually read Karl Marx knows, the central issue of his critique of political economy was to abolish wage labor. You'd think that somebody had you'd think that the workers themselves had somehow assimilated all of this through 200 years of agitation, or whatever, 100 years of agitation. But it doesn't seem that, you can't, if you can't bring it up then, then and
No.
nobody understands
No,
it, then,
some
then
people
he'll
have been
hang
bringing this up for over those years, but they're a tiny minority of people, you know, who publish a little journal that's read by a
yeah,
thousand to 1% of people, and even
I'm
they
aware.
don't agree on what they mean. It's just a slogan, you know. So the question, I mean, a lot of the SI article is critiquing other revolutionaries who are precisely kind of muddled in this way. Like
Right.
you get to a practical situation and they'll say, oh, we don't dare do anything with that. That would be interfering with the workers or something, you know, and somebody else's, you know, and so the situationists are, you know, they're looking for the lever, you know, the sort of point of purchase where something will come up now, like on May 17th or something, we can actually say this meaningfully. If we said it in May 1st or something, it doesn't mean May, it's just a slogan. You can say slogans all you want. But suddenly, when you get like where there's the Sorbonne Occupying Committee, and Rizal is one of the members, and he has proposed to the assembly, I vote that, you know, that we have direct democracy here among us, so no bureaucrats and blah, 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 and that we call for occupation of the factories and formation of workers' councils. And this is like, actually, the occupation of the factories did happen. The formation of workers' councils didn't. But even the occupation of the factories, you have to see, was something that people would have just roll on the floor laughing if you had mentioned it a week before. They would have said, man,
Yeah.
you're out of your, not, yeah, you know, what are you talking about? That's never going to happen. Okay, that's happened, but there's still, you know, you're way, way away from this, but things move very fast in a radical situation. As I said, like in a week, suddenly you go through drastic changes. So they are claiming, or Debord is claiming, he said at some point, we were just an hour away from something like this happening. Well, I'll get to there when we go on. But any other questions, or we can.
I have a
comment?
question.
Yes, Kim.
Just a clarification, when Debord's referring to the Stalinists, is that interchangeable with the Communist Party? Is that who he's talking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, specifically, obviously the Maoists are also Stalinists, but when he says this, you know, he's talking about this major party that's, you know, got millions of people in it and all that. And it's the actual Russian style Stalinist thing. Enzo, unmute yourself.
I think that it's interesting that de Gaulle threatens to bring in the army to start this civil war. From what I've understood of the Situationists, they don't seem particularly militant. Was there any part of the Situationists who wanted to react in a militant manner and to continue fighting for what they wanted at the time, or how did they react to that threat once de Gaulle posed that?
Well, your use of the word militant is maybe a little unfortunate, because usually that means like it's some fervent radical that's, you know, ready to fight the cops, or, you know, have extravagant slogans or something. As far as like fighting in a civil war, they're just saying, as they've noted elsewhere, and I have also in The Joy of Revolution, revolution is rarely very much military. The military things have a part in it, but basically, let's take, for example, May 68, you've got 11 million people occupying factories, okay? So that is a fact, it's not a fantasy. Now, supposing that some of those people, I actually will get to that in the next quote I'm going to be doing, but supposing that they do take over the factories, they don't just occupy them, they kick out the union bureaucrats. They said, we're running this for direct democracy here. We're calling on other factories to do this. Now, suppose that workers of that consciousness are in control of all the factories and the trains and, you know, all the other things like that. What is an army going to do? It can't do shit. Right? I mean, if they're holding out like that, the army is just like 1% of that. I mean, they can go in if they want to and just murder everybody in a factory, but how practical is that going to be? Is that going to win people's support, or you know? So the reason that armies can be effective, or police, is that most people are neutral. You know, they don't want to risk their lives, and you know, they don't even know what these other people are fighting for, or something like that. So if there's only a tiny, like if there's only a few thousand people fighting for something, they'll just get arrested or killed. It's very simple. And the other people would just say, oh, that's just this tiny lunatic fringe, and they were resorting to violence, so we had to kill them all. You know? But so it's not a question like of calling for take up arms or something like that. I mean, so I think that's enough of an answer there. Was there somebody else?
Yeah, that explains it very well.
We'll actually get further into it in the next thing I read from.
Yeah.
It's a good question. Shall we move on here? Is there? Okay, Peter puts a thing in the chat, which he says the junta in Greece collapsed in the early 70s after massacring students at the university. Case in point, you know, namely, it was just so brutal and so crude that people who had put up with this sort of de facto quasi-fascist regime, you know, that finally they just were disgusted, and that they lost all their support, and they can't exist without that kind of support. Let me just move on here, because we got a little, and because I think this answers what Enzo was talking about to some extent. So this is going back to page 299 and 300 in the SI anthology. If in a single factory between May 16th and May 30th, a General Assembly had constituted itself as a council, holding all powers of decision and execution, expelling the bureaucrats, organizing its self-defense, and calling on the strikers of all the enterprises to link up with it, this qualitative step could have immediately brought the movement to the ultimate showdown. And this is what we're talking about. A very large number of enterprises would have followed the course thus discovered. This factory could immediately have taken the place of the dubious and in every sense eccentric Sorbonne of the first days, and become the real center of the occupations movement. Genuine delegates, in other words, revocable rather than representatives that you get to vote for 3 years later or something. Delegates who, you know, would have been sent there with the mandate and come back and remaining totally democratic. Delegates from the numerous councils that already virtually existed in some of the occupied buildings, and from all the councils that could have imposed themselves in all the branches of industry, would have rallied around this base. And sounds kind of far-fetched, but once somebody gives an example of something, just like somebody gave the example of occupying a factory a few days earlier, and then a couple of weeks later, thousands of factories are occupied. You know, all it took was something like, oh, they could do that. We could do that too. It's not you know, rocket science or something, but you need examples, and that's what happens in radical situations, that you get them, but there's also a timing element. it doesn't matter that you just accumulate nice examples or nice ideas, because you're in a race against time, because other things are moving in the other direction. People are getting bored, people are getting tired, people are hungry or whatever. So such an assembly could then we're talking about this assembly that has become sort of the National Assembly, could have proclaimed the expropriation of all capital, i.e. buildings, land, blah, 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 including state capital, i.e. all the stuff the government owns or runs. They could have announced that all the country's means of production were henceforth the collective property of the proletariat organized in direct democracy, and appealed directly, by finally seizing some of the telecommunications facilities, for example, to the workers of the entire world to support this revolution. Some people will say that such a hypothesis is utopian. We answer, it is precisely because the occupations movement was objectively at several moments only an hour away from such a result that it spread such terror, visible to everyone at the time, in the impotence of the state and the panic of the so-called Communist Party, and since then in the conspiracy of silence concerning its gravity. So I'm now going to shift back to Joy of Revolution, because in this part, this is a little more condensed than the SI article. And I say, what prevented this from happening was above all the labor unions, in particular the largest one in the country, the Communist Party dominated CGT. Inspired by the rebellious youth who had fought the police in the streets and taken over the Sorbonne and other public buildings, 10 million workers ignored their unions and occupied virtually all the factories and many of the offices in the country, launching the first wildcat general strike in history. But most of these workers were unclear enough as to what to do next that they allowed the union bureaucracy to insinuate itself into the movement it had tried to prevent. The bureaucrats did everything they could to break, B-R-A-K-E, and fragment the movement, calling brief token strikes, setting up phony rank and file organizations composed of loyal party members, seizing control of the loudspeaker systems, rigging elections in favor of returning to work, and most crucially, locking the factory gates in order to keep workers isolated from each other and from the other insurgents, on the pretext of, quote, guarding against outside provocateurs, unquote. The unions then proceeded to negotiate with the employers and the government a package of wage and vacation bonuses. This bribe was emphatically rejected by a large majority of the workers all over the country, who had the sense, however confused, that some more radical change was on the agenda. In early June, de Gaulle's presenting the carrot-stick alternative of new elections or civil war finally intimidated many workers into returning to work. There were still numerous holdouts, but their isolation from each other enabled the unions to tell each group that all the others had resumed work, so that they would believe they were alone and give up. And as I noted one time during the occupation movement, somebody asked me about that. And I said, if we were back there and we had cell phones, that whole thing might have been different. Nothing more than, not the internet or just a few cell phones, so that a worker in one factory could call his buddy in another factory and say, hey, what's happening over there? Oh, we've just called the thing, and we just locked up our union bureaucrat. Oh, yeah? And word would get around, like almost instantly, even if there were just a few phones, but there weren't any. Back then, if you called the factory, it says, hello, Stalinist Union at your service. What can I help you with? And you could, they would not tell you what was really going on, or they, give you. So just as little as that would have made the difference. I don't know how far, but it, literally you have people in the factory who didn't know what was going on in the next factory. And the unions lied to them and said, oh, the next factory, everybody's going back to work. And then in that other factory, they say, oh, that factory over there has already gone back to work. We might as well do it too. We're all alone here. So everybody goes back to work. And then when it's all over, they go, what happened? Well, you were hoodwinked. And how would you have known differently? Or if you're watching TV, you're certainly not seeing what's really going on. And if you're listening to the union or the Communist Party speakers, ditto. So then they go on to discuss, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but it's kind of a neat thing. Since the defeat of the occupations movement, both those who participated in it and those who had to endure it have often asked the question, was it a revolution? And then they point out that this, all the kind of delusive means of this, like including the thing like, well, it didn't win, so it wasn't a revolution. And Debord points out the reference to the success or failure of revolution mean nothing for the simple reason that since the bourgeois revolutions, like the French Revolution, so on, the American Revolution, no revolution has yet succeeded. Not one has abolished classes, which is the only reason for a revolution, to go beyond the bourgeois type of societies. And then, but he goes on to say, nevertheless, there have been things in the past that we can legitimately call revolution because they really caused a big turmoil, and called into question their societies. And they give the examples of the 1905 revolution in Russia, which is where workers' councils were first invented by workers, not by radicals. And the Spanish Revolution, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, the Paris Commune of 1871. And they're saying, like in each of these cases, all the crises cited here as examples, though deficient in their practical achievements and even in their perspectives, nevertheless produced enough radical innovations and put their societies severely enough in check to be legitimately termed revolutions. And then, so the implication is, yes, revolution was there in some sense or another. And then he winds up the article with having the results of the movement, and he points out that it reverberated around the world. And they mentioned the Mexican students' revolt just a few months later, which resulted in hundreds of them, in that case, getting killed by the police. So in that case, it worked because it just, what might not have worked in France worked in Mexico. And so most people have hardly ever heard of it, but it was, they mention it here. And then a few months later, around the same time, you had the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, which we'll be discussing in January. There's an article called Reform and Counter-Reform in the Bureaucratic Bloc by Coyote about the Prague Spring. And there was a somewhat of a radical movement in Yugoslavia. And, there were various other kind of things around there. And so I think I'll wind that up, that part, and just going back to the documents. I haven't gone into the documents too much because I think they speak pretty much for themselves, but I will just note that the first document is a real, you know, this is when they're in the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne has a democratic assembly that has elected a committee, including René Rizal, one of the Enragés, who later became a Situationist member. And they're in there, and I want you to note this thing here. This partly answers what Mike was asking about. Namely, you don't just call for something in the abstract, like down with the, I mean, you can do it. You can say, I believe in this, or this is our program, or something like that. But it makes a difference. Like if you called for occupying the factories, just if we went out in the streets now, it would be completely idiotic. Nobody would, you know, it would have no effect, and people would just think you're insane. But if it's already starting, then now you can go, so look how they phrase this. And this is probably written by Rizal. Comrades, considering that the Sud Aviation factory at Nantes has been occupied for 2 days by the workers and students of that city, and that today the movement is spreading to several factories, Nouvelles Messageries de la Presse Parisienne in Paris, Renault in Cléon, etc. The Sorbonne Occupation Committee calls for the immediate occupation of all the factories in France and the formation of workers' councils. Comrades, spread and reproduce this appeal as quickly as possible. Sorbonne, May 16th, 1968, 3:30 p.m. So a very neat, concise little thing. And notice that a third of it is saying what's already happened. And they're saying, considering that this is already going on, we feel it appropriate to call for more of the same, basically. Again, if they had called for it a week earlier, it would have just seemed stupid. People would have just been laughing at them and nobody would have paid any attention. But when they do this, they can say, hey, you've already started doing this, folks. Let's have some more of it. We're in favor of some more of it. That doesn't sound quite so utopian. Utopian in the sense of unrealistic. So then this thing, which was probably written by Debord, but in consultation with the other people in the Council for Maintaining the Occupations, is the address to all workers. And notice again, you know, when you're talking about, you know, communicating, agitating, something like this, and you're a little group, you publish a journal or you issue leaflets from time to time or something, that's one thing. And it's significant. That's how all movements have had part of that there, but it's minute. You know, it's just like a few people read it, and if it's really interesting, they may discuss it and go and do similar things themselves, and it may spread a little bit, may clarify some issue. But when you get to something like May 68, where suddenly the whole country is at a standstill, I mean, basically you're talking like to 40 or 50 million people here. And they're gonna hear it because of the nature of the thing. Whereas before, when you put that out, nobody even looks at it, you know. But here, this text that I'm about to read part from was printed by striking workers in coordination with the Enragés and Situationists. They said, sure, we'll print that. How many do you want? 300,000. Will that do? Right on. So these workers in a striking print thing print 300,000 copies of this leaflet. And then, I mean, it's like a truck full. And then they truck it all over France. you know, anywhere they can slip it in, smuggle it into a factory or whatever. So it's less delirious than it might seem just to read it, you know, like, oh, who are these people talking about this? So just picture that, like if 300 copies of the leaflet are there, it was probably read by 1 million people within 1 week. And this was before cell phones, before the internet. I mean, right now we would think, well, shit, you know, I can email that to blah, blah, blah. But this is at a time when the media are not at your disposal. You've got to pay to just do that dinky little leaflet. It's even before photocopying practically. You know, you'd have to Mimeo it or something. So in this case, they printed it nicely. You know, on this leaflet, I used to have a copy of it, which is now at Yale. So I'm going to read parts of this. Address to all workers. Comrades, what we have already done in France is haunting Europe and will soon threaten all the ruling classes of the world, from the bureaucrats of Moscow and Beijing to the millionaires of Washington and Tokyo. Just as we have made Paris dance, the international proletariat will once again take up its assault on the capitals of all the states and all the citadels of alienation. The occupation of factories and public buildings throughout the country has not only brought a halt to the functioning of the economy, it has brought about a general questioning of the society. A deep-rooted movement is leading almost every sector of the population to seek a real transformation of life. This is the beginning of a revolutionary movement, a movement which lacks nothing but the consciousness of what it has already done in order to triumph. And I'll skip a paragraph or two. At the present moment, with the power they hold and with the parties and unions being what they are, the workers have no other choice but to organize themselves in unitary rank and file committees directly taking over the economy and all aspects of the reconstruction of social life, asserting their autonomy vis-a-vis any sort of political or unionist leadership, ensuring their self-defense, and federating with each other regionally and nationally. In so doing, they will become the sole real power in the country, the power of workers' councils. The only alternative is to return to their passivity and go back to watching television. The proletariat is, quote, either revolutionary or nothing, unquote. What are the essential features of council power? He lists about 8 or 9 of them. Dissolution of all external power. No state, blah, blah, blah. Direct and total democracy. 3, practical unification of decision and execution, so that you have those two things going together. You don't have some people who decide and the other people who put it into practice. Delegates who can be revoked at any moment by those who have mandated them, as opposed to representatives that you elect for several years and they're in a distant government, and 5 years from now you can re-elect them if you want, or elect some other person that's just as bad. Abolition of hierarchy and independent specializations. And that's kind of an interesting key thing. We're talking about independent specializations. It doesn't mean that we don't have a brain surgeon anymore, or we don't have this or that. It means that whoever is in such positions doesn't rule because of it. In other words, they're not independent vis-a-vis everybody else, like, you know, so you can blackmail everybody. We're going to turn off this factory if you don't do this or something. Conscious management and transformation of all the conditions of liberated life. permanent creative mass participation. So you don't go back to where 99% of people are not participating, even if they temporarily were. They're doing it all the time. Internationalist extension and coordination. Can't be just one country. The present requirements are nothing less than this. Self-management is nothing less. Beware of all the modernist co-opters, including even priests, who are beginning to talk of self-management or even of workers' councils without acknowledging this minimum, what he's just listed, because they want to save their bureaucratic functions, the privileges of their intellectual specializations, or their future careers as petty bosses. In reality, what is necessary now has been necessary since the beginning of the proletarian revolutionary project. It's always been a question of working class autonomy. The struggle has always been for the abolition of wage labor, of commodity production, and of the state. The goal has always been to accede to conscious history, to suppress all separations and quote, everything that exists independently of individuals, unquote. Proletarian revolution has spontaneously sketched out its appropriate forms in the councils. In St. Petersburg, Russia in 1905, in Turin, Italy in 1920, factory occupations, in Catalonia in 1936 in Spain, in Budapest in 1956. The preservation of the old society or the formation of new exploiting classes has each time been over the dead body of the councils. The working class now knows its enemies and its own appropriate methods of action. Quote, revolutionary organization has had to learn that it can no longer combat alienation by means of alienated forms of struggle, unquote. The Society of the Spectacle. Workers' councils are clearly the only solution, since all the other forms of revolutionary struggle have led to the opposite of what was aimed at. Signed, Enriger's Situationist International Committee, Council for Maintaining the Occupations, May 30th, 1968. So I will stop there. And please, any comments or questions? Sid, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, where were you just reading from? Where was that?
In do you have this book?
Yeah.
Okay.
Page 443.
Yeah, it's in the section that's called May 68 documents. It's called
Oh.
Address to All Workers, 443 through 445.
Okay.
And then right after that is a bunch of made graffiti.
Oh, you brought up about communication and cell phones, and
Yeah.
I thought about the what would happen nowadays with cell phones. Like, I was thinking about one of the problems that is noted is that the workers, the proletarians, the people in the factories, they didn't have control of their own communication, and their enemies essentially cut them off. You
Yeah.
know, like Kant. Nowadays, it would seem like one would have to be in control of telecommunication. I mean, it seems like if you were using cell phones, there's a lot of this, what do they call it now? The censorship industrial complex. A lot of a lot of people talking about, trying to say things, and then particularly during this last pandemic episode, where communication was just shut down. It was, people were censored.
Uh-huh.
And sort of curious. I mean, this is just a practical question. How, if you started talking on cell phones, what would prevent? Is there anything that would prevent the power from shutting your particular cell phones down? I mean, I don't know if that's possible practically.
I'm not the person to ask because I'm not very tech savvy, but the thing is, there are new things like that that could come in. But once again, you have to consider if the people who run the society start doing that, it's kind of difficult for them to do it without disrupting other things.
Their own
I
communication.
mean, occasionally you'll hear that that Saudi Arabia or North Korea or something has cut off all internet connection with the outside world or something like that. But if they do that, they're just digging themselves in a hole. You can't function that way, and if you're in a business thing, which many of these things are, I don't know. In other words, there would be new contradictions there, that there's only so much you can do. Like in China, for a long time, the internet has been censored, but people get around it in different ways, and then they censor that, and then they get around, you get encrypted
Right.
stuff, and how can they tell you that you've got it encrypted? And once they tell that, then some new thing is invented, and so the same struggle goes on. I mean, the struggle in Russia used to be, I remember like in the 1950s or something like that, they had what they were called samizdat, which meant the illicit underground communication. And the Russian rulers were just panic stricken about the idea of that getting out of control. So as a result, it was hard to get a typewriter. Not even any, because they were afraid, well, that would facilitate rapid, doing of mimeos or something like this, and so, but obviously, if it's hard to get typewriters, what kind of economy are you going to have? When you're competing with America or something where there's 1,000 times more of that kind of stuff, you're just going to guarantee that you're backward. So, and you're spending all your social surplus on spying on people or something. Some people do that, but it's not a very efficient way to run a society. So I don't really know. I mean, it's hard for me to get my head around all the internet and all the other intersecting ways of communication. I'm just saying that in the context of May 68, cell phones alone could have made a huge difference. It's not like demanding that they had the internet or something.
Right.
And so once there are internet and cell phones and all that, I mean, we saw during the Occupy movement and Arab Spring and stuff like that, the internet became very useful. So if it's censored, it's kind of hard to censor things when millions of people are sending messages all over the place.
Right. Or do you know if there's any people, like, it seems like one of the things that put a clamp on the 68 was the isolation of the factories and the
Yeah.
workers who believed they're bureaucrats or, whatever. Were there any people who didn't do that, who somehow said, wait a minute, this doesn't seem kosher or whatever, there's
Oh,
something.
I'm sure there was, but you have to just say that, I mean, there were obviously a lot of workers that sort of felt that because somebody had to have occupied the factories and it wasn't the unions that were
Right.
asking them to do it. So there were enough people that were sort of saying, hey, yeah, let's this looks like something's going on here. You know, let's not get left behind. And obviously, like if the Situationists put out those 300,000 copies, you know, most of them got to workers.
Mhm.
So there had to have been some places where they could slip them into somebody, or I don't know. It's just that we're talking about time. You know, like if it's a matter of hours, like if they can do this before this happens, and you make it hard for them to slip it in the factory, you know, you postpone it until maybe it's too late. A day later, maybe, oh, the whole momentum is gone. You know, there was a time here, whereas if the leaflets had come in at that point, you know, maybe it would have just exploded. But by the next day or two, oh, I've already, you know, we're already back at work, and are we going to do that again? Bruce,
Yes, can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to make a point on cell phones and communication by the internet. There are protests all over China occurring all the time, protests and individual strikes. But what they're faced with there is that the state apparatus has able to shut down and censor the internet and track cell phone communication and effectively shuts anything down before it starts to proliferate. Indeed, during the COVID crisis, there was the beginnings of a real explosion of discontent, and they managed to contain it because of this ability to control, censor the internet and
Yeah.
monitor cell phone communication.
Yeah, yeah. So all these things we're talking about are what we have to deal with. You know, just like add stress.
Hi guys, sorry I'm late. I went to the Schick Machine event in San Francisco. I'm wondering, is there anything prescriptive in here? I mean, we're looking at history, and I appreciate that. But I mean, obviously, it seems prescriptive that when a strike starts to happen, it's started by the factory workers, the proletariat, which should certainly be encouraged. And but it is, I mean, is the idea for intellectuals and other proletariats to wait for the inevitable first factory to close? I mean,
No, no.
yes, and then the other thing is, I mean, you know, when that first factory to close, I understand what would be prescriptive to do, but I mean, like could you maybe reference these strikes that have started with Starbucks and so forth? I'm just wondering if we can take away something where we can be on guard for the right way to shift our weight.
Well, I think that in most cases, when strikes happen, certainly many of them in the U.S. that I'm aware of, there's not a whole lot going on besides what appears. In other words, they're striking for higher wages, or they're striking for, you know, whatever. And we can surmise that maybe there are other dissatisfactions or something, but it would be probably foolish to read too much into things. So bear in mind that what we've been looking here is exceptional. It's what I call a radical situation, where suddenly, because of street fighting and because of agitation in the universities and, you know, then in the factories and so on, you build up this thing where they can appeal and say, hey, this factory is being occupied and they're doing this, let's go further. But a month earlier, they weren't saying, let's call for occupying all the factories, because it would have been silly.
Well, I see
Nothing
that.
happening there.
Yeah,
So what they were doing is other things on their own level. In other words, the enragés for 2 months were focused on their school,
There were.
their university. They were disrupting classes. They were critiquing various professors, something very local. And you might say, after we're thinking about the whole country, this seems very dinky. But the point is that that's how it started, is that they were focusing. If you remember that Strasbourg scandal comic, right at the end, it says, because it is by looking at real life and real and it's very intimate things that we will see emerge great people with great characters and great ideas or something, like focusing on some specific thing. So all these things like strikes or riots or, various kinds of ways that people struggle under what I call it like ordinary situations, kind of normal situations. They have their own interest, and that's where we are 99% of the time anyway. So we have to look at that and say, oh, well, that strike didn't work out very well because they didn't do this. They fail, and you can kind of look at these things and see something else might succeed kind of accidentally, and you look back at, well, why did that work? And, why did the Occupy movement happen when it did and not a year earlier? Other people have tried the same thing. So you kind of look retrospectively and try to figure out what's the weak points and strong points there and all that. But that's all you can do. Greg.
Yes, actually, kind of dovetailing on that. I remember when I got into the Situationists first in the '90s, anarchist milieu, the criticism was that they shouldn't have stopped or shouldn't have made worker councils as the ultimate end, and should have somehow gone beyond that. Obviously, it's hard to say, what that criticism entails beyond, just kind of a free for all utopian. But I remember that being one of the criticisms, right?
Well, you will note when we meet 4 weeks from now, we'll be discussing some other things from 1969. And there's an article by Rizal about workers' councils and an article by Vanagem about self-management, which is roughly the same thing, not exactly. And in both cases, they're emphatically saying, we're not saying this is the ultimate end. We're saying this is the beginning. We aren't even there yet, and some of these other sidewalk supervisors are saying, "Oh, why didn't you go further? You can't, blah blah blah." Yeah, when the whole concept of workers' councils itself is such a mind-blowing thing, that most people can't even conceive of how that would be. And so to say, "Well, don't stop there," hey man, you didn't even get there in May '68. All you did was a hint of it. And so it's just like the reasons that a lot of these things like strikes or boycotts, there's a few basic kind of means of struggles that have developed over the centuries. And one reason is that they're real simple. Like a strike is you just stop working. An occupy, you just take over. A boycott, you stop buying, or something. And anybody, even illiterate or something, can sort of get the idea. If it becomes a practical thing, you can say, yeah, let's stop buying that, or let's stop riding these buses in Montgomery, Alabama, and and everybody can come in on that, and it works. But if you started talking, and then once it starts working, then you can go further, and there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, ultimately we want to get to a society that doesn't have classes, that is free and, blah, blah, blah. And it's good to state that and to understand exactly what you mean, and that you don't mean some fantasy thing. You're talking about things that people have tried, like in the Spanish Revolution and so on. But to do more than that, you're just, I think you got the idea there.
Yeah,
Bruce?
thanks.
Let's see, unmute yourself.
An example that people generally don't take note of was the strike movement in Poland in August 1980, which resulted in what spread across the country, and it was all coordinated through what were called interfactory strike committees. And I, for the life of me, thought they were almost identical to being workers' councils. Indeed, the New York Times at the time had an editorial about it and referred to them as workers' councils and made reference to Rosa Luxemburg in the editorial. The fact that it was subsequently captured and channeled into Solidarność, which was later on taken over by the right wing and the clerical elements, doesn't alter the fact that this was a living, that what existed in that movement in August 1980 was a living movement of workers that spread a strike across the country and was coordinated through what were called interfactory strike committees, but were effectively, for all practical purposes, workers' councils.
Yeah. Oh, I agree completely. Yeah. And you put it very well, because it's like if we talk about labor unions as opposed to workers' councils, there's a huge difference there and all that. But it's obvious that some things, like if solidarity people started out with unions, and then it kind of evolved in a way that they weren't really acting like unions, but they still had the label. And so you have to make adjustments there and say exactly as you have, like, hey, for practical purposes, we have a sort of workers' councils thing going here, whatever they want to call themselves. And then we can also see the limits of their thing when they get taken over and figure out how did that happen and so on. But that's a very good point.
The problem was that there was no people agitating within those councils to try and direct them towards actually taking control of the Polish economy.
Yes.
And it was just basically came under the guidance of people who subsequently turned it into the Solidarność.
Yeah.
But that whole phenomenon just terrified the Stalinists across Eastern Europe, because they were afraid of it spreading.
Right.
And what subsequently happened was, when martial law was declared at the end of 1981, after the declaration of martial law, Solidarność made a sharp turn to the right, because at that point the CIA and the Vatican were all pouring money into it, and they effectively got control of it.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you've made a good point here. Also, I mean, some of the same things in what I read here, you might think where Debord is saying, we don't want this, we want the complete, the abolition of wage labor, the state of class societies, and that might seem, or like the management of society, the workers' management, or the population's management of their whole lives, not their control, which I think in one of our previous meetings was pointed out. Like workers' control is sort of like you have some influence. You can say, no, there's too much of that, or we don't want that. But management is you're deciding where to go, not just that you're putting in a veto now and then, or a complaint or something. And those kind of issues that might seem rather abstract and, who cares about all those details? When it comes to the point in Poland that you're talking about, it becomes very practical. They have a thing that are kind of like workers' councils, where they actually have power, but because they don't have the consciousness of what they've already done, to use Debord's phrase, they let that go. They let people come in, whether it's the CIA or the priests or the government or whoever, to say, okay, yeah, yay workers' councils, yay solidarity, something. Now go back to work and you'll get better conditions and more weight, and it suddenly kind of segues into business as usual. So, any other comments here, Sid?
So in relation to that, like relation to the question of, lack of consciousness of what what has already been done or what history is, et cetera. There's a lot of that, discussion going on in these readings of ours. Like, for example, on page 295, this is something that's a little confusing to me. It says, by launching the wildcat strike, the workers gave the lie to the liars who spoke in their name. And then it says, in most of the factories, they, and I assume it means they're referring to the workers, proved incapable of really speaking on their own behalf and of saying what they wanted.
That's
But
correct.
in order to say what they want, it is first necessary for the workers to create, through their own autonomous action, the concrete conditions that enable them to speak and act, conditions that now exist nowhere. So that's, I don't quite get that, maybe.
Well, let's say, like, if you, well, let's look exactly what that's talking about. You're a worker in a factory, and you and some of your fellow workers decide to launch a wildcat strike. You've talked to the unions and they don't want to go on strike. And I say, well, screw you, we're going on strike. And so you do that among some of your fellows. So that's already refuting the idea that the unions are your leaders, or that, they're the vanguard or something like that.
Okay.
But in most of the factories, they proved incapable of speaking on their own behalf and saying, what do we want? In other words, they could say, we want to go on strike here because they're doing it in Paris and we want to blah, 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 or whatever. But they're not very clear, like, what are we going for here?
They didn't know what they wanted. I mean,
Well, there may be different points, like you've got hundreds or thousands of people. And if you can imagine, why are we doing this? One person might say, well, I'm not getting paid enough. The other person said, well, I think I'm getting paid. Okay, that's not an issue for me, but I'm really pissed off at how that boss browbeats me all the time. Or another one says, I'm just pissed off at, I can't stand these union jerks. They're just like blah, blah, blah. Or somebody else is saying, yeah, they've got a million problems like people do in this society.
right.
And one way to express that might have been like, let's just strike, the hell with it. Fuck all this shit, And if you said, what are your aims? It would be kind of, yeah, and yet you have a group of people who are already doing something together. So it's not like they're not doing anything. But if you say, what are you gonna, articulate what you want, you might have somebody who's very articulate and says, oh, well, we want to do this. But if you had somebody to say, oh, we want to abolish the wage system, I mean, people say, huh? Where's that guy coming from? But if somebody put it in a little different way that says, we're tired of being bossed around here, I don't know what the solution is, but we're da da da. What were the people in the free speech movement at Berkeley going for? Well, you could say, oh, well, they were demanding the right to free blah, blah, blah. Yes, that was the formal thing, but would that have alone have been a big issue, like for people to go to jail or something? So they're doing that partly because there are other things in there, even though they're not named, like there's civil rights, there's the Vietnam War, there's all these things. And so there were probably things in France that were analogous to that, and they didn't know how to put it into words. And because they didn't know how to do it, they could be outmaneuvered. And the reason they didn't know how to do it, it's kind of nice how he puts it, say what they wanted, but in order to say what they want is they have to create through their own autonomous action the concrete conditions that enable them to speak and act. Because if you're in a factory normally, and if you're in a union normally, you don't get to speak very much. And if you do get to speak, it's because we're, order, we're talking about this topic now. We're not talking about your frustrations. We're not talking, we're just talking about how many are in favor of going for higher wages. So, you know, you don't have a chance, therefore you don't ever even get to practice it. You know, you don't, you know, you'd be embarrassed to talk in public because you've never done it. Whereas in another situation, like in May 68, you might find yourself at the Sorbonne where you're encouraged to talk. And you come up with something, or you hear somebody else say something, and you say, yeah. Or you look at that graffiti on the wall, it says, don't liberate me, I'll take care of that. You say, whoa, yeah. You know, so they've, to some extent, have created the situation in the Sorbonne is more free than the factories. So, you know, youth can get away with doing some stuff like that and easier. In a factory, you're going to be fired if you do stuff like that. You can't write graffiti on the wall. You know, if you got up in the middle of a union thing, you know, I mean, seriously, in France, you might get beat up. You know, if it's a Stalinist union and they think you're advocating anarchism or something, you say, hey, mark that guy down. You know, he just insulted us.
So, so the, yeah, so, yeah, I can sort of see that. So the people who took over these factories, like, it was just spontaneous, so let's do that? I mean, just from some general melee?
Yeah, because the unions were not saying that. And the unions would be the usual people who would say, hey, we're going to do this, or, you know, usually they didn't even ask, but if they asked, they said, shall we do it? Yes or no.
So was the spark for entering into the occupation of the factories was the spark the student thing at the Sorbonne, or?
Yeah, yes. Remember, not just at the Sorbonne, there was street fighting too, and some young workers were there also. So this is, you can imagine that mostly the workers, if you talk to them in a month earlier, they say, what do you think about students? They say, oh,
Mhm.
what a bunch of intellectual namby-pamby bullshit or something. Yeah, you know, I mean, ask that now of anybody, you know, ask some blue collar worker, what do you think about the students at Cal or something? If they were honest, they would say, I don't give a shit about them. We think they're stupid, or I don't know what the fuck they're up to or something, you know. So, but when they see the students or other youth fighting police and holding them off, and then getting arrested by the hundreds, and then fighting more to the extent that suddenly the government backs down, then they think, hey, these guys are going. You know, and so, our friend Joe over there was, you know, there, and he said they're pretty cool and all that. Well, now what's going on? We've been hearing about it all over the place in the last few days. What's going on at the Sorbonne? Some of them go to the Sorbonne and they get an idea of this dialogue, you know, debates and stuff like that going on, all kinds of wacky things. And they go back and say, hey, they're doing this, and, you know, why can't we do that here? Are we suckers? They can do it there, you know. So however it started, some of them did do that, and then workers at the other place imitated them. They might not have known anything about the Sorbonne, but they heard that these other workers were occupying their factories, and they said, okay, sounds good to us, you know.
And the first workers who were occupying their factories, what was the impetus for that? What was it that, like, all of a sudden they said, okay, let's occupy the factory, or what?
Well, the students are occupying the Sorbonne.
Let's occupy the factories?
I don't know. The point is, except for a few people like the Enragés, no one was telling them to do that. Certainly not the unions or the Communist Party or the Socialist Party or the Gaullists. None of them were saying occupy factory, but they were looking at the example, and the example was kind of cool. You know, they said, hey, what's to stop us from doing that? Are we slaves? So they do that, without necessarily knowing anything, they may not have any goals. They're just pissed off. And
Mhm.
some people who are pissed off may riot, because they don't even have a job. And like in Watts, they don't have a factory to occupy. So they riot. But if you're in a factory, you immediately sense that you have a little bit further leverage. You can hold this factory at ransom. So
Mhm.
anyway, I mean, there's
So it's kind of like becoming aware that there are things you can do which will enable you to get your power back.
yeah. I
A
mean,
reminder that we are at the top of the hour. Just want to remind
okay.
you.
Okay, Zach, we haven't heard from you. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, sorry.
Hi.
I just wanted to follow up on that very briefly. One thing that I think gets left out of these discussions a lot is there's a long tradition of wildcat strikes in French factories. And in the years leading up to May 68, there've been quite a number of them. So this was not like a completely unfamiliar tactic. And Ken, I disagree with you a little bit about what you said about the French police and their reaction to the events outside the Sorbonne. They were brutal. They were as brutal, if not more brutal, than any of the American police reactions to the protests in the U.S. In which white people were involved.
Yeah.
Leaving account when black people were involved, then live ammunition was used. There was widespread revulsion against the police response in Paris, and that was really one of the key triggers for a lot of the initial general strikes, a lot of the initial factory strikes and occupations, wildcat strikes. Then once that, as it became more generalized, people suddenly realized for the first time the potential economic and social power that these strikes had, and that there was now this sort of unified national movement, and things exploded in a way that was completely new.
No.
But there's a French context here, and people had experience with using wildcat strikes and disobeying the unions and complete factory occupations and locking up management.
Uh-huh.
They were able to build on that.
Yeah, actually, you had a tradition back in 1936 during
Not
the
to mention
Popular
1936.
Front. There were factory. I think that was the first time that there were really widespread factory occupations, and that despite the fact that the Popular Front had come to power, which was supposedly a progressive thing, but the Popular Front had a lot of trouble controlling that. But they finally managed to do it in the same ways. You kind of buy off some and, make compromises. And then when things are back to normal. I apologize. You're right. I didn't mean to say that the French police were nicer than Americans by any means. What I meant was that the people who order, the government or whoever's ordering the police to do it, were fearing, like, oh, if they go in and do that. I mean, some of the police, they've murdered people, in other circumstances, but in circumstances that were a little more under the radar. But the point is that they're under orders of de Gaulle or people like that. And so they don't dare, again, following World War II, police in many countries of Europe were kind of afraid to look too much like the Gestapo because that had a very bad aura about it. So one of the slogans was CRS equals SS. The CRS was the riot cops, and SS was stormtroopers. So yeah. Anyway, and you're right. I should have mentioned that part of the initial when we're looking for why would they occupy factories was a protest in favor of the young people, the students or not, against the police. So it could have been perceived or what felt as being, we're speaking out for this. And as a result, you had the government pulls back. because it's perceiving that this is they're digging themselves too much of a hole here. So then the police come back, and then it's like a power vacuum, and everybody can invade the Sorbonne without worrying about being arrested or anything. They can even vandalize things and so on. And some of the workers come in, so then there starts being this thing. And you're quite right. Then once it starts, then other people looking at the other workers start saying, hey, is this all we're doing? What, they obviously have the idea that you strike for some purpose usually. And so they say, well, why are we striking? Are we striking for higher wages, to get people out of jail, or to what? But the point is that it was not too clear. There was just sort of a general thing so that the Stalinist bureaucrats and the unions could say, yeah, we're protesting against de Gaulle, which hadn't really been the point, but they're acting as if, it's just, well, I think enough said. I think we better wind up here. We're already a little bit late, and I have to get up early tomorrow morning for a plane.
I'm just wondering if something like this could happen at Berkeley. Like what would be the conditions for something like this?
Well, the closest thing did happen in Berkeley. It's the free
Right.
speech movement.
Right, but I mean, how can that continuously be regenerated?
Well, that's what you have to look at that and try to figure out
Okay.
how things fail, how things get tired, how they get boring, how they get too stressful, and then people want to go back to normal, even though normal is kind of blah blah. That's one factor.
But I mean, the
It doesn't
inception.
always have to be police or something brutal like that. It can just be that, oh, this is just I had it.
No, I mean the inception of it. I mean, we've had a number
Yeah.
of strikes on campus, but it's always been for pay or something like that.
Yeah. No, and again, that's something to look at. I deal with that a little bit, and if I can toot my own horn here, I wrote that little book, The Joy of Revolution, which is included in Public Secrets. It's on my website.
Okay.
It would make about 100-page book. And I wrote that over a period of several years because of all these kind of questions that we've talked about. I was saying,
Yeah.
I've more experience than many people, not than some, but I've looked at these things, I read histories of these things, and I participated to some extent. And so I tried to, over several years, I tried to know, what does cause these things? Well, some are triggered by this, but on the other hand, some are triggered by that. So, hey, you can't just set a rule to say this is how you do it. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes there's this, but I could come out by saying, in general, you want to work towards such and such tactic that, opens things up a little more. And then I'll give an example of that. And then I'll say, like in May 68, they did that, or look how the free speech movement started. It happens, and you see how various movements started and also how they end, how they're crushed or how they just sort of fall flat. People get bored with them or whatever. So those are the kind of factors that we have to look at so that when something like May 68 happens, or I would say the Occupy movement is a bit like that. That's the closest thing we've had to something like that. When something happens like that, that you sort of, okay, we're at this stage now. This is kind of like May 68, but it's different because of da-da-da. And so you can kind of cross back and forth there and say, well, what did the Situationists do when da-da-da? And in some cases, that can give you a good idea. Oh, they just wrote an insulting letter to somebody, or they invaded this with rotten tomatoes at this thing, or, there are various things, and you can say, well, that might be a good idea to try here. At least we'll try it. and see, we'll know what we're trying to do. We're trying to trigger something that goes farther and farther. And to do that, we're going to be in a little better position than people who just think it's a matter of electing somebody or passing some reform or something, because we have a little bit more sense of where we're trying to go. That goes to the person earlier who asked about abolishing wage labor and so on like that, Mike. So if we sort of understand that, then we can maybe be a jump ahead of somebody who doesn't understand that, including the rulers in many cases. So we can just, it's a big process.
Process, yeah.
But anyway,
Thank you.
I think that what I tried to do in The Joy of Revolution was sort of to put a situationist type of revolution, like to say, how would this happen? What would it be like if it did? Are there things where I disagree with the situationists? Yeah, a few minor things. But basically I'm just saying, well, what about this whole topic? What about people who say, that'll never happen? Well, the situationists can quote that, just before May 68, somebody said, oh, that will never happen, and then it happens. So, you have responses to these things, but you also have to acknowledge there's a lot of problems. I say, hey, this may never happen. But if it does happen, I think it has to be, it's more likely to happen this way than that way, and so on.
The possibility of having in people's heads you can live after the boss is directing you and the managers are managing you, that you can live just fine without them is I think the big step, trying to get Americans to believe that.
Well, I would say there's one step that's even more complicated, is that living without the economy, because it's a little easier to say we can do without bosses, but it's kind of hard to say. And again, I talk about that. I say, the economic stuff is more complicated. It's a little harder to conceive because you have to imagine organizing internationally various things. And if you're not using money, if you're not using wage labor or something, how do you? So that's even harder than the idea of doing without bosses. But those are the two biggies. So I really do need to wind this down now, but thank you very much for some good questions here. And so
Can I make one quick point?
Okay, Bruce.
I just want to reaffirm what Zach said about a rich history of worker struggle in France really having facilitated what happened in May 68. And I would note that in 1953, there was a workers' uprising in East Berlin that spread throughout Germany. And in that uprising, workers' councils were evident, and people were hearkening back to the uprisings in Germany following the First World War. So there was there was a continuity there that really was conducive to what happened.
Thank you. Okay. Take a quick look at the chat. If there's anything, as always, you can email me if you wanted to find out, because I will have a copy of everything in the chat here, and any links that people may have given. So we're going to skip 4 weeks ahead. I think our next meeting is January 14th. So, and I'll be sending out an email for that tonight, because like I said, I have to leave town tomorrow morning. So look forward to seeing you there. And those of you who are in the literary group, I'll see you on January 7th, but in each case. And those of you who are in the Bay Area, I'm thinking of having another year-end party, but it will be in January rather than December. So if I may not be clear in some cases, are you in the Bay Area or this or that, but I'm going to be inviting people in our literary group and those of you who are in the Bay Area also in this group and maybe one other group that I'm in. So that would probably be on January 6th or 13th on Saturday. So we'll see how that goes. So thank you again for your participation, and I'll see you one way or the other in January.
All right.
Remember to turn off the recording, Ken.
Yes, I will
Happy
do
New
that
Year's,
right
everybody.
now.